Okay, at 6:30, a little past time to get started. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. We've got a good turnout here. And
thanks for being here.
Thank you for thanking. Anyway, just a couple of things first before we get started. I know a lot of you are on our emailing list, so if you're already on there, if you get an email from me telling you about these presentations, you don't have to sign up. But if there's anybody here that's not on our mailing list and would like to be, so that we can inform you when we have these presentations, just please put your name and email address on here. Like I said, if you're already on the list and you get an email from me, no need to put your name on here. And also, in case you're wondering, if you haven't seen our emails, the state of our museum. So we did purchase it. We had a closing last week, Monday, and so we are now, the Historical Society is now a property owner. So while we raised enough money to purchase the building, we still are in need of added funds as we go along, because there's a lot of work inside that building to get it up to shape and be museum worthy. So also just recently we got an endowment from the Columbus Area Endowment for $4,144. We applied for a grant for UV protection for the front windows, so our artifacts, including the Hasty popcorn wagon, will not be damaged by the sunlight. So so that was good news. Just a couple of things as far as our future presentations. For October, on October 23rd, we will have, it'll be on the Farmers and Merchants Union Bank. We're going to start out here briefly that night, and then from here we're going to walk that whole half a block over to the bank for a tour. And the bank is asking that we kind of get a head count as far as how many people will be there, so they know how many tour guides they have and how many smaller groups that we'll have taking the tour. So I'll be sending out an email on that as well. And then November 20th for our final one for the fall, we're going to do the history of the Columbus 151 Speedway. And we got Bill Bloomer Jr. sitting here right behind Mr. Manline. And he and I and his dad, and amongst others, are going to be working on that presentation. So that'll be November 20th. So on to tonight's presentation. On the history of the Columbus Hospital. Notice I didn't say Prairie Ridge because it's been known as 4 different names over the years. And so I just tonight want to hand it over to Patty Walker, and she'll be our moderator tonight.
Thank you, Randy. Before you go, we would like to present you with a donation.
There you go, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Really excited to hear the panel tonight, and proud to support the Columbus Area Historical Society. Great cause. So can't wait to hear the panel.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. This is John Russell. He's our president and CEO at Prairie Ridge Health. And tonight with us we have Dr. Bruce Krause, and who is a current physician and started in 1978. Bob Black, who was on the hospital board in 1979 when we moved to our current location. Is that correct? Okay. And then Carol Black, who worked at the hospital for over 55 years in the laboratory. We have Deb Telg, who 31 years in the ER, and was also served as our employee health nurse for many, many years as well. And then Carol Smith, who worked in everywhere for more than 50 years as an LPN. And Darlene Marks, who worked as an LPN on med-surg for over 50 years. Yep. So I'm going to give the basic history of the hospital. It looks like I lost. And then in 1956, an addition was added. What year did you start at the hospital, Carol? 66? Carol? 63, Darlene?
61.
In 61. So this happened before any of them started. Our OB, one of our OB manager, Rachel Svensson, just included some information about childbirth for us, because it has changed so much from long ago. So home births were very common back then, and then it switched to hospital births with physicians. So that was something that our nursing staff here saw as time marched on. In 1956, the addition was added, as I said before. This building eventually was sold by the hospital in April of 1981 for $110,000 to a group of investors who renovated the space into the senior apartments that are here today, which are the Santa Maria Apartments. Did anyone live at the Santa Maria Apartments? Anyone? So then the 1960s hit, and that's when these three started at the hospital. The hospital continued to grow through the 1960s, and by 1970 it was a 70-bed facility. Darlene and Carol, can you tell me a little bit about when you first started at the hospital?
Sister DeLillis hired me. Started on a Sunday morning. I started on a Sunday morning, couldn't get in the place. I didn't know how to get in, the doors were all locked. So I had to run around the place, I found a doorbell, and then they let me in. And I started working on the OB floor, and there were 9 babies in the nursery, that's why I got called to work. And I got a half-hour orientation, and the nun said, get to work. And I got to work.
Where were the Sisters of Divine Savior? Where were they from?
I think Milwaukee,
Oh, that's how they got off here.
yeah. Yeah, they were the Milwaukee ones.
Okay, I started in 1961, and Sister Michaeline hired me. I met her in the hospital lobby, 2:30, and my shift was the PM shift, 2:30 to 11 PM. So she took me to the floor, introduced me to everyone, and gave me an orientation, and that's about the way it went to start with. We will continue on with more stuff we were doing.
Carol, do you remember when you first started?
Well, when I came, there was Marion Smith and myself and Roberta Migo, and we were all working in the lab. And we had Sister Gadelia, who was our weekend and nighttime person, so she took call and helped out on weekends, and then when things were beyond her capacity, then we were called in.
So there's a couple things going on in this photo. This is a fire drill, which I thought looked very scary. Is that how you guys did fire drills back then?
Yeah.
So they have a bucket that's on fire, has flames coming out of it, and then they have their fire extinguishers there. And then this is a picture of the lab. Oh, Florence Franz right here. Yep. So these photos are from the newspaper, and I actually found one of Carol Black right here. It says Mrs. Gerald Salzwedel and Mrs. Robert Black, both medical technicians doing a blood count. So this is Carol, and this is Mrs. Salzwedel. Is it the other way around? So that's Carol. This is Mrs. Salzwedel. So I thought it was interesting that in the newspaper, they didn't recognize women with their first name if they were married, only by their husband's name, and that's how it was.
As you can see in there are 4 different parts to doing a CBC. There's the part with the microscope, the part with where we spun the blood for hematocrit, and then there was another part that did a white count by hand. And then there was another part that did a hemoglobin, where today we put it on a machine and 30 seconds later it comes out.
Then we have another photo. This has Carol in it. And it says, Mrs. Richard Smith, LPN, is working with a group of older patients making fluffs used as dressings. The patients include Mrs. Katie Kehoe, Henry Westfall, Charles Berger, Aggie Nellen, and Mrs. Nora Primo. I also thought it was interesting that all the patients were named by full name in the newspaper, which would never happen today. Do you remember the fluff, Carol?
Oh, yes. That was, they made the fluffs and then we sterilized them and used them for dressing. And they were all patients. That was in the activity.
That was up on second floor, and that was a long-term unit.
So then we have a couple more photos from 1968. This is the hospital kitchen. So Mrs. Lester Seibel and Mrs. Corning Wright, dietary personnel. You knew them? Okay. And then Mrs. George Freck in surgery. Frake? Oh, Frake, yes, that's right, okay. Mrs. George Frake in surgery, making a surgical record for the patient. And they name the patient's name again, even though you can barely see him. Mrs. Fred Shade is the patient. I also thought that, can't believe they named it. And then the x-ray department here, it says the x-ray department is one of the busiest in the hospital. It is used both by patients in the hospital and outpatients. Seen our sister Gadelia. Did you know her? And Mrs. Jack Wheeler from Doylestown, the assistant. And again, they named the patient again.
You want to tell me a little bit about the sister?
Well, she was trained to do some of the lab work and to do x-ray, and that's basically, she covered both departments in helping us.
So this is Wilma Lenz. Does anybody know? Everybody knows Wilma Lenz, right? So she worked in the nursery, and so by the time Wilma was there, women were having babies in the hospital, but they were there for quite a long time. Does anybody want to talk a little bit about how long someone was in the hospital?
They had a child?
They were there usually from 5 to 7 days. If things went good, then they get to go home after the 7th day, probably. And the babies all stayed in the nursery. They didn't room in with the mothers. We had to take them out every time to feed them. We had to bundle them up and take them out. And we had to make all the formula too for the baby, to sterilize it with sterilizer.
I know when our son was born in 1965, went into labor and got there, and there was no room available for me, so they were gonna have to put me in the hall. And this was habit way back then. You had more patients than you had rooms. But lucky for me, by the time they got done with me and I could go to my room, that patient had gone home, or a patient had, so then I had a bed.
Remember the time we had 12 patients in OB, and our OB department had, what, 4 rooms, 5 rooms maybe? And they were all the way down the hall, and then turned the corner and all the way down the hall. Patients were all out in the hall, because we had so many OBs that day.
All right, so on to the 1970s. On October 1st, 1970, the hospital was purchased by members of the community, and Columbus Community Hospital was formed. By this time, the hospital had grown to a 70-bed facility serving Columbus residents, as well as the area and communities surrounding it. So this is a membership card. John Caldwell, as many of you know, he was the first member of Columbus Community Hospital on September 28th of 1970. So this is just how the hospital progressed with its name and logos. So this was after we became Columbus Community Hospital Incorporated. This logo was developed. So you may have items with that logo on it. And then through the years, it continued until our name now, Prairie Ridge Health. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So in 1976, it became apparent that a more modern facility was needed and plans were made for the construction of a new 68-bed hospital. This new hospital would be located where we are now at 1515 Park Avenue, and it officially opened in January 24th of 1979. Bob Black sat on the board when we were planning the hospital, is that right? And so, Bob, can you talk about how the board decided to purchase the land and how they got the land?
Well, I think the critical thing was that it became evident we had to move. We had to do something different. There was a proposal to remodel the existing facility for about $2.9 million. But that would have required us to tear down the old wing, and what would we do in the meantime for hospital care? Plus, we were right on the cusp of med flight, and I don't see anybody on Lewis Street really welcoming helicopters in the middle of the night. The facility was very outdated, even though we had put up a new wing in 1956. If anybody can remember, the ER was on the 3rd floor, and the elevator was the slowest thing on the face of the earth. So, for some reason, the morgue was on the 1st floor. I'm not sure. But anyway, so the decision was made to make a move, and it required, of course, going through state planning. There was a hospital planning commission encompassing input from 11 different counties, and the prospects of building a new hospital were not very good at that time, just because there were limits on what was going to be allowed. But we managed to get past that. The Hospital Planning Commission decided that they had not accounted for Columbus's growth and hospital or patient base adequately. There were some other influences as well, and so we ended up purchasing land from Jack Kaza, where we are currently, and going ahead with the building project.
Thank you, that's interesting.
Okay, so along with the hospital, we also built the Columbus Clinic. And Dr. Kraus came to us in 1978. And he always says he started when the hospital was a hole in the ground.
Given that, I'll give a little personal note here. Like I said, I'm a farm boy from Wisconsin. I grew up in southern Wisconsin, graduated from Clinton High School near Beloit. And originally I wanted to become a veterinarian, and I went to UW River Falls, entering pre-vet, was accepted at the University of Minnesota Vet School, only it didn't feel right. I just felt the world had changed and I wanted to get into maybe medicine. So that all worked out. I got into the University of Wisconsin Medical School. I met my wife-to-be, who was sitting here tonight. After 52 years, we married, but she was from California. So she convinced me to maybe try to get a residency in California. So I trained out there for 4 years. I met a colleague of mine who was from San Francisco. We hit it off. We thought we'd like to start a new practice somewhere in California, but in a smaller community. And we looked at many locations, and it just didn't feel right. I had kind of a homing instinct. And so about that time, there was a recruiter that came out, and one of my colleagues who's from California said, well, I'm not interested in Wisconsin because I'm going to stay here in California, but I know somebody from Wisconsin. So Pam and I went out with a recruiter one night, and we were invited to come to Columbus in October of 1977, and looked at what was then the hole in the ground, with the promise that there would be a new hospital there within the next year or so if I would come. Other recruiting was going on at that time as well. I don't know the details of that, but maybe you remember Dr. Chuck council. He and I both came to Columbus in the summer of 1978. And that original clinic building, getting back to that, was built with 8 independent solo practice suites. That was the intent at that time, that we would all practice in our own separate business, if you will, work together, but we would have our own separate business. So the original clinic building was built with 8 suites, was occupied originally by myself. I was the first one in the building in December of 1978, because the hospital was not yet completed, would not be completed for another month or so. So I spent about 4 to 6 weeks out at that clinic as the first document of the building. And eventually we had a family physician, myself, internal medicine, general surgery, and OBGYN occupying those suites in that first year.
So I'm sure that everyone here, except for Debbie and I, remember the move to the hospital or the move to the new hospital, because it happened on the day of a snowstorm. A blizzard. 2 days. The story's getting worse. And schools were closed, yes. So I did find an article about the move, and there's just a couple of excerpts that I'd like to read to you. In a flurry of activity in between flurries of snow, 38 patients of the Columbus Community Hospital moved Wednesday from the old James Street Hospital to the new $3.8 million 68-bed complex just south of the city. $3.8 million. And despite blowing winds, drifting snow, and a towed-in ambulance, we'll get to that later, the move finished several hours ahead of schedule. "It's unbelievable," said Carol Smith, a hospital nurse, amazed at the speed of the move. "That's the only way to describe it." Carol, tell me what really happened.
I know my family, my husband and my daughter both came and helped move, and then move lots that they could, so we could. They helped us move. It was just fun. We had a fun day moving in the snowstorm. Oh, you didn't get stuck at all.
Okay, I remember that very well as well. Because of the snowstorm, there were 2 nurses, Eileen Hart, an RN, and she lived in Waterloo, and Betty Wright, an RN, she lived in Fall River. And they knew if they went home from work that day, before the storm came, they'd never be back to help us move with the storm. So it wasn't unusual for bad weather that these 2 people would stay overnight at our house. We had a big meal and visited in the evening and got up and dressed and we were ready to go to help move. I was on the receiving end at the hospital, getting the patients. There were others that were stationed.
I was at the other end. I was at the old hospital, and I remember the last patient to leave was a gentleman from over by Bristol. And he was so sad that he was leaving that hospital. We were going to the new one. And we assured him it would be much better where he was going.
I'll just add one other note. So one of the first patients that I got into the room, and the big complaint, first complaint right away, "It is so cold in here," because the register, the patient was, the bed was right up against the wall, and right here was the register, and it was blowing cold air on. And so he wasn't a happy camper. So immediately that was reported, and then it was all repaired and things worked better.
Okay, Carol has a story about the lab.
We had an unusual circumstance. We had to have all our machines ready and QC'd in the morning, and we drew all the patients for all their blood work so the doctors would have the morning run. Then we had to take the machines down and set them up at the new lab, and by 10 o'clock we had to have blood work done on the new patients that were coming into the hospital. And And the first patient that came in was my son.
And she's right. So in this article, it also says, it was a day of first for the hospital as Lee Pillsbury was admitted as the first new patient in the building, and Stephen Black, whose father, Robert Black, sits on the hospital board, received the first shot given in the new building. An unexpected patient also surprised the hospital when an ambulance transferring a patient from Waupun to Madison broke down. A tow truck pulled the ambulance into the new hospital's receiving area, dropped off the patient, then towed the disabled ambulance to a nearby garage. Bob, do you have anything to say about the move?
And Dr. Kraus?
Actually, I remember very little about the move, except that it went very, very smoothly given the circumstances. So that's really what I recall about it.
Okay.
So I also have a hospital annual report here from 1979, and Bob was the president at that time, right? So at that time, there was a little bit of a deficit. Is that correct? I just meant just a little bit, because there's good things that have happened through the years, and this is part of why we're so great.
Well, it was a traumatic period for the Columbus Community Hospital. Yes, there was a deficit. One that we weren't aware of at first, but became painfully clear as time went on. And required some fundraising on the part of the community. There were over 400 people that stepped up to help us out. There were some other acts of benevolence on the part of people that I can't bring up at this point, but just suffice to say that a lot of people stepped up to keep this hospital going. Not only did we have a new hospital, but we had a new viewpoint, a new philosophy of management. I was going through a report from I guess it was Mr. Johnson from Meritor, who took over, they took over the management of the hospital, sent out Devon Barracks as a replacement administrator. Columbus Hospital grew a great deal in that particular period of a year or so. Management, reporting, everything stepped up to a new level. As I said, it was a traumatic period, but we got through it, and you have what I think is a first-class facility today, thanks to the people who came after us. So.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for all of your work. So, I don't know if any of you have heard, but we're building a Sun Prairie clinic that's going to open next week. And it just so happens that back in 1980, we were actually in Sun Prairie at a clinic there called Prairie View Family Practice Clinic. Dr. Kraus, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Well, Bob might know a little bit more about that. What happened is the clinic building that was sitting next to the old hospital was actually moved to Sun Prairie. And Dr. Jan Bird had been recruited for family medicine out of that clinic. And it seems a little crazy these days, but I worked with her and went down on Tuesday afternoons to do internal medicine consultations. And family medicine doctors these days are trained very well in adult medicine as well was the way we tried to initially have a presence in Sun Prairie, because we saw that, even though Sun Prairie was really relatively small in population still at that time, we saw it as an opportunity in the future that for our hospital to continue to grow, that we would like to provide services in Sun Prairie area. Unfortunately, because of some turnover issues, Dr. Bird decided eventually to take a position with the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Mark Tummerman came after that. He decided to take a position, I think, with the, he was called Physicians Plus at that point. So we weren't able to, and I think the administration worked extremely hard, as I recall, to try and find physician staffing to keep that clinic going, but it was not sustainable at that time. Bob, do you want to say anything more about the decision to move that building?
That was one of our things that we came up with, I guess, to try to expand our market. Obviously, it was about 40 years too early, but I'm glad to see it's come to fruition, and I'm sure it's going to be a success this time around. Again, some private people stepped up to make this happen. One of the people who helped get the clinic to Sun Prairie was Mr. Bart Klotzbach of the Wisconsin Cheeseman. And I don't think too many people knew or remember that name, but he had a lot to do with bringing it to Sun Prairie.
All right, so then we move on to 1981, and all of the hard work that Bob is talking about paid off, and they held a fund drive and they hit $600,000 needed to close their loan. And so it says in the Columbus Journal on August 3rd of 1981, the Farmers Home Administration conducted the final closing of a $1.28 million loan to Columbus Community Hospital that will allow the hospital to restructure its debts from short-term, high-interest borrowing to long-term financing at a greatly reduced interest rate. So that's great. It all worked out.
Where's the Sun Prairie location gonna be?
It is at 155 South Mallard Drive, so it's off of the Main Street exit, near Discovery Storage. Does that?
That's not the
Menards,
one up
no.
on the hill there where they're building?
No.
Closest to Madison.
Oh,
At the second roundabout lot, if you turn right on Main.
okay.
So then this just talks a little bit about, in the late 1900s that we started using more technology for giving birth. Did you have your, I had my daughter at Columbus Hospital. Did you have your?
No, I didn't, but I did have Dr. Coverman.
So then, time marches on, and the 80s and 90s were great. Does anybody want to say anything about the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, when you started working at the hospital?
So I started in '93, and at that time, Wendy Dam was the nurse manager of the ER, and we were preparing actually for urgent care to start. That was what we were, I was a graduate nurse back then. Everybody had to co-sign my charts, and everything was on paper, but we didn't see the volume, obviously, that we staffed with two, usually an RN and either an LPN or a GN like myself in the ER, and that worked out fine at the time. Then urgent care started in January, and we never looked back, I guess.
And do either of you want to talk about what patient care was like in the 80s and 90s as far as staffing and how many inpatients we typically had and things like that?
We did a lot of team nursing, working together. With my working on the PM shift, Sister Michaeline was always there, but then she left the convent, and then Sister Paulette came, and so she was in charge over the medical floor. And so, trying to think of got them ready for tests. They came in for whatever their illness was, and we cared for them, whether it be pneumonia or they're just coming in to have gallbladder x-rays and barium enema x-rays and colon x-rays, and it took a week to get through that because each day you had to prepare one day for each one you were. So sometimes I even noticed family would be gone for a few days because mom and dad were in the hospital getting checked over. But that all worked out well. But that was mainly a lot of charting, like I said, by hand. And we would chart day shift, you had to chart in blue. If you worked the PM shift, you charted in green. And if you worked the night shift, you charted in red. We gave baths to the patients, and helped them with physical therapy. And thinking about physical therapy at the old hospital when I started, it was just one small room with a kind of a bed like you could sit on, and you could lay down on it, and they could give you exercises. And we had one small whirlpool in that one room. That was physical therapy back in the 50s, 60s. We're great for what we have for today for rehab and cardiac rehab that we had also at the hospital. We used to have to wash up all the utensils when patients went home, and then we'd send them up to central service, and then they'd be sterilized and then brought back down, and then they would be used again. I think that kind of covers it.
I can take you back to when I first started. We had to make the formula for the nursery. We sterilized the gloves. You never threw a glove out. You washed them, you powdered them, and you sterilized them. We used to make up all the OB packs. Fold it in a certain way, put it on a pack, and we had to sterilize it. Yeah, and you had to do all the meds, but everything was, we didn't get rid of anything. Syringes were always sterilized and used. Needles were used. Imagine.
Carol, anything?
Well, I just remember some of the old tests. We didn't do very many tests in the lab, but the ones that we did, I read about them in history books now, because each one was individual. And when you did a blood sugar, you had a tube, and you mixed the chemical, and you mixed the blood, and you went back and forth so many times, and then you had to read it in another machine. And we've come such a long way now because you put your little tube on, and it gives you 20 different tests in 8 minutes. It's really mind-boggling to know where we came from and where we are now. But the machines have adapted so well, and we rely on machines in such a way. But and we do so much QC of all the stuff that we're doing. You just don't do a test. There's so much testing that you go on and do QC for, and that has also been streamlined a lot. But just to make sure that we're doing accurate work.
Dr. Kraus, would you like to talk a little bit about, so Dr. Kraus, when you started, that was a time where there wasn't just an ER doc and just you did everything, is that right?
For a number of years, we shared taking call. Being on call meant if a patient came into the emergency room, you went from your clinic or from home to go in to see the patient. And there might be nights where you would have no calls whatsoever. There might be nights that after the third or fourth call, it's now 3 o'clock in the morning, you thought maybe I ought to just stay here. So we would do that, but I want to diverge just a little bit because I thought something was quite humorous in those days because we weren't that busy in the emergency room. Dr. Chuck Hansel had been a runner and had done some marathons, and he wanted to get a running club together. And I had done a little bit of running, so I was interested in that. By the next year, Dr. Jim Hicken had come, and he was family medicine. He was interested in running. So we got a running club together, and after clinic hours, we would be done about 5 o'clock. We had pagers in those days, no cell phones. So the one that was on call would put the pager onto their running clothes, and we would take a run out into the country. We get about 4 or 5 miles out into the country, and sure enough, that pager would go off. And so then we start running back into, and many times I showed up in the emergency room in the early evening wearing my running clothes and fully in a sweat. But fast forward now, I think, I don't know if you're going to get to that, but I think we're seeing 60, 70 patients a day in our urgent care ER, and we have a full-time physician, have had that for many years now. We've had a full-time board-certified emergency medicine physician and physician assistants accompanying them, and I don't know, Gabby, you have to help me with what the nursing staffing is like, but we've seen a tremendous growth in our services through emergency medicine and urgent care.
So on to 2000, early 2000s.
Debbie, you talked a little bit about what the ER was like before the new one, before the new one.
Well, and I can say, I actually worked the night we moved from the old ER to the new ER.
That's like,
There's no snowstorm down the hall. The old ER, do you guys remember there was a long driveway where you came up to the garage and people would honk their horn, and we would get up from the nurse's station, we would go out and help them get out of their cars or whatever. And like Dr. Krell said, at night we would be the only ones there, so we would call the doctor, we would get some orders started based on what the complaint was. We would call lab in, we would call x-ray in depending on what we needed. Med surg was our backup as like if we needed another set of hands kind of thing. And that is definitely not that just wouldn't work anymore. A lot of things have changed, and we usually staff a couple people now. We see a fair number at night, not like days and PMs do, but I feel like at night they're maybe a little sicker. I mean, if you're gonna get out of bed and come in, right, you're gonna be hurting. And so there's usually more long-term workups, that kind of thing that takes time. We have lab 24 hours now, so that helps a lot. X-rays there until 1 o'clock in the morning. That's just, it's very helpful. It at least speeds up the process. Our doctors are right there. We used to, even when Dr. Kraus was working the ER, he would be up on second floor if we didn't have a patient. So we would call him down if we needed something, but most of the time the nighttime docs are in the department helping answer the phone. It's a teamwork. It works as a good teamwork.
So in the early 2000s, the hospital the hospital administration at that time, the board decided that we needed to build a new ER. And we really did need one, because we were all tired of honking our horns. And so we held the first capital campaign since the 1970s. We hadn't held one since then. And as a result, we were able to build a new emergency room that was completed in May of 2004. So it's been there 20 years. So can you believe it's been 20 years? In 2005, we expanded the front entrance of the hospital, so we put in the canopy that's there, and a new gift shop, and remodeled the medical imaging department. And then we added a 4th floor to the building. Does anybody want to talk about that? Adding the 4th floor. It was awfully noisy, yeah. So we brought in a big crane, and we added the 4th floor, which was done in 2007, and that's when we celebrated our 100th anniversary. And at that time, we employed over 250 employees. Does anybody know how many employees we have there today, besides John? 450, yep. Is it 450? Is that right?
No, we're like 525.
525. It grew overnight. 525. So yeah, we've more than doubled. More than doubled. So during that time, we also added a new OB department. So we moved the OB department from the second floor to the third floor during that time. That was in 2011. And then in 2014, we launched construction of a 34,000 square foot surgical services addition, which we completed in 2015. And that's our beautiful new surgery center that is used today. Then in 2019, that's when we broke ground for our clinic building right here. And so that also included demolition of the original 1979 clinic building, which was just a wood structure. Does anyone remember the day where they demolished that building? It went down really, really easy. It was just a wood structure. So, and the new space opened in October of 2020. And then we also changed our name in 2019, and we changed it to Prairie Ridge Health. We needed to have a name that would convey the breadth and depth of our services that we offered to our area, to the areas that we served, and so Prairie Ridge Health was a very well thought out name for our organization. And so that's who we are today. And I'll change that number. It's 525 employees. So I'd just like to give everyone a chance to just add anything about that you wanted to add about the history and your time in the hospital.
Well, I would comment, a lot of people say, I thought you had retired, and actually I just say, no, I just got tired, but jokingly. But I am doing a little part-time consulting work yet with the hospital, but I would say over 44 years of practice in Columbus, I had many, many other opportunities that really has been satisfying to me. I had an independent practice for 38 of those years and sold my practice to the hospital for the last 6 years of my practice. But because we were close to Madison and because of other things the hospital was involved with, I was able to get involved with some leadership activities. John can hopefully give you a little bit more information, but I had an opportunity to be on the hospital board for 19 years out of the 44, not all continuously, but different times, so I saw a lot of these different phases of development. I did want to comment on the critical access hospital, it says that, so there was a point where we took a hard look at our finances, particularly with the Medicare reimbursement issues. Without going into detail in the weeds, some people are going to come up and talk about that a little more, and John would know a lot more about that. But Medicare pays hospitals with something called a diagnostic related group. So let's say pneumonia. So there's people might be in the hospital for a day or two with pneumonia, and then they go home, and other people are in the hospital for 2 weeks or more, and they're on ventilators, and they're critical care, and it's very difficult. So smaller hospitals sometimes didn't have the volume of any particular diagnosis that they were really able to sustain that financially. So we did a lot of analysis and decided that we would become a critical access hospital under the Medicare rules. And what that meant is we could continue to maintain a hospital, but we had to limit ourselves to 25 acute care beds. We had to keep our length of stay down. It was mentioned that oftentimes people many years ago stayed a week or two or more. Well, we had to keep our length of stay on average of 96 hours or less for the Medicare patients. And then we were paid differently, and John, that's really going to get into the weeds a little bit more. I can tell you how we get paid under Medicare. It's really a cost basis, so we're actually getting reimbursed more or less by the actual cost that it takes to take care of that patient while they're in the hospital. So that was a big decision at that point. We now are growing primarily in our outpatient services. That's why we now will soon have 4 clinics. Many of our services, patients come for a procedure, a CAT scan, an MRI, other procedures, and go home the same day. That's happening everywhere, but that's what's really pushing our revenues. And John, help me here, but I think probably around 80% of our revenues these days are outpatient services, and the 20% come from the people that are actually in the hospital with acute care. And then there's other things, there's observation stays, acute care stays. It's very complicated stuff, but bottom line, I would say I am extremely grateful for the opportunity that I and my family had to be part of this organization. There were times where we were sure it was going to survive way back in the early 1980s, but we are thriving, and I don't think John would mind my saying this when we have recruit going on, people come in, when I've been involved with that, I'd say, I don't know that we are perhaps the best critical access hospital in the state of Wisconsin, and certainly among the best in the nation because of our quality of care issues, our ratings that our patients give us on the Press Ganey surveys that go out continuously. Some of you probably fill those out. I'd be surprised if you haven't. I've filled them out myself when I have been a patient in the emergency room. And I've been very pleased to be part of the quality committee, continue to sit on that quality committee as a community member now. And this community should be extremely proud that they have a hospital facility of this type that can provide these services to our community. So, not to toot that horn too much, but because I am retired officially, I hope we can see what the next 100 years will be like. And who knows what you look back and what are you going to have in your newspaper? Oh, they don't have newspapers anymore.
Bob, how many years did you serve on the board?
6.
6 years. So I just want to thank you for your years that you served on the board, because I know that that's a lot of work. Anything that you want to add?
Well, I was reminded this afternoon, I was going through my own box of records and clippings of what a quantum leap we've made in the past 40 years. The financial reports back in the late 70s were written out in cursive on a spreadsheet. That was pretty surprising to me. I didn't realize that we were still doing that back then. Whoever did that had very good penmanship. Wish we were teaching our kids to do that yet.
And Carol, and Darlene all became volunteers. Well, Carol was a volunteer while she was an employee at the hospital. She was a team member. But then after she retired, she stayed on as a volunteer. She also served as president of the volunteers, is that correct? How many times? Third time. 3 times. Oh, you're serving as president again? Oh, congratulations. So 3 times as president of the volunteers, also as public policy officer, and anything else? And that's about it. Well, anything that you would like to add?
Well, I'm glad that I was a med tech at Columbus Hospital. I've seen the changes in the lab from handwork up through the modern day when we do a lot of things by machine. And I've been glad to be part of a team that worked with patients and be able to care for patients, because we all do work as a team, whether we go to ER, when a patient comes in and everybody does the testing and the x-rays and whatever they do, and then you get to see them up on the floor, and then you get to see them go home. And that type of culture, when you can see a patient and see what's happening to them, that's kind of a neat experience, and to be part of it. And so I'm glad for that. And I was going to say also, the gift shop started in the old hospital back in 78, I think, or 77. We had a person sitting at the switchboard, and she says, well, I can watch that. So we started a little gift shop, and then that was the start of our gift shop. And yeah, so we've had a lot of fun doing the gift shop and buying for that for many, many years too. So that glad to be part of this culture.
Okay, Deb. And you saw the transfer of the ER from the old ER to the new ER, and now that's been there 20 years. So talk a little bit about that.
was just thinking when I first started, with Carol. She used to know so much, as a new grad, you have to lean on on the ones that have been there a while, and shoot, now I'm that person. Or some of the new ones, and we've been very lucky with the things, we were talking earlier, we can monitor you out at the nurses station, almost every room has a cardiac monitor in it, that wasn't the case in the old ER. We couldn't see anything out at the nurses station. We could monitor you in the room and that's about it. Not that that was bad, it's just, it's just a different thing that's worked out really well. I don't know. I've been here 31 years, and I guess there's a reason you stick around someplace, and it's because you feel good about it, you feel what you're doing good, people are happy to see you when they come in, and they enjoy it still, right?
So Carol, after she retired, we said, why don't you volunteer? And she said, well, sure.
I miss working. I really, really miss the emergency room and all the patients. I enjoyed every day I went to work. It wasn't a chore. I was glad to go. And now I like being a volunteer because everybody comes in and, oh, you're still here. Not working though. And I want to run out there and help them get out of the car, and I can't do that. But I'm just glad that I had the opportunity to work all the years I did.
I really miss work as well. I enjoy being a volunteer because I see some of the co-workers I used to work with, but they're getting fewer by the day because people have retired as well or they've passed away, so that was hard. I just wanted to touch a little bit on how cardiac care more became on med-surg floor with Dr. Chubb when he was here. It was very interesting. That's when the nurses station that we were in, they had to cut a hole in the wall because we had 2 telemetry patients in that room, so we could monitor them on the heart monitor. They even had a portable one that you could put a patient in the hall, which, you don't do that today, but he was on, or she was on a monitor in the hall, so we could monitor them. And then another interesting thing was transportation. When someone had to be transferred from our hospital over to Madison, it was Zeidler Funeral Home or Jensen's. And usually an RN always went, but they couldn't find an RN to go. Then they would let an LPN go, so several times I went. All very interesting, but a few other tidbits in the old hospital with the nuns. Father Nelman lived there. And there was a beautiful chapel in that old building. And Father Nelman lived there, and then that was our job to check on him often throughout the day and take him his meals. And another tidbit, if someone was a Catholic, was very critically ill and near death, then our job as nurses was always to get the box so they could give the last rites. And we'd call Father Nelman and tell him, we need you. And we'd have everything all set up how he wanted things to be done. The morgue was in the basement. Kind of spooky when you had to take someone down there. Let me see. Trying to think a couple other things I was going to mention. Oh, I think another question Patty had asked us or thought about. How many hours did we work? Well, Carol and I both worked 8 hours a day, sometimes overtime, and 5 days a week. and every other weekend, that was just routine. Our uniforms were white, and we had to wear a hat. And if someone was in isolation, you had to take your hat off each time because you couldn't wear your hat in an isolation room with your gown on. Wore a name pin, did not wear pants, you wore dresses. Let me see, what was they say? I enjoyed working there, and the reason I left is I always said to Carol, I'll never ask you when you're gonna retire because you'll know when you're ready. For me, it was getting to be, I was 50 years or a little over, and the computer, and always having to update all this whole computer system. I was ready, but I very much enjoyed working there, would still work there today if I could. Kept my license until just a year ago, just in case. But through COVID, being a volunteer, after we had our vaccines, the volunteers then could be volunteering at the hospital and taking all these patients that needed vaccinations to get the vaccinations. So we're very honored to be able to do that. I think we've gone a long way from day one here, and we're very, very fortunate. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for coming here tonight and speaking about the hospital. Is there any other thing that anyone wants to add?
I have a question.
Okay.
No mention was ever mentioned, Mr. Black here, Dr. Garman, did you know him?
Oh, yes.
He was an interesting character. Came through Danville every night to go to the hospital.
Judas Priest.
Yes,
Oh,
yes,
that was his
at
favorite
board
book.
meetings.
I think,
Yeah.
and Theo, his wife.
Yeah, that was another thing I was gonna mention, all the different doctors that were, like when I first started in Waterloo, there was Dr. Sharp, Dr. Garman, and he always made late rounds at night, and if it was about, I was just about ready to go home, I was off duty, and it's 11 o'clock or 11:30 or midnight, he'd say, well, Marks, if you're ready, I'll take you home, because I didn't drive. I walked home every night up to Little Mexico, so, anyway, many nights Dr. Garman gave me a ride home. And then we also had Dr. Barron and Dr. Russell that came from Sun Prairie that was here. Dr. Shelley. Dr. Dianson, yes. So, yeah, it's been wonderful to work here, and I'm grateful to be a volunteer.
Any other questions?
One observation, I've had some tests that needed to be done, like a CT scan and other things, and if you try to get into UW, they'll schedule you 5 weeks out. If you decide to do it at Prairie Ridge, it might be 2 days.
That's good.
Do you know when they first started using helicopters for transport?
I remember landscaping the heliport.
Okay, after the ambulances from Johnson and Zagros, then if a transfer or somebody from UW had to come out and pick up a patient, I remember that first night, and I called John and said, I'm not coming home or ready to come home yet because this UW is coming out and their first way of transportation was a bus. And I just wanted to be inside that bus and see what it looked like before, so I stayed, but it was it was equipped very well for transport patients. And of course, now we have MedFlight, and how fortunate we are.
I don't know when MedFlight actually first started or where we used MedFlight, but I will just make an observation on one particular diagnosis and care in the hospital. And this was true everywhere back in 1977, 78. If somebody came into the hospital with an acute myocardial infarction, we would place them into a monitored bed. We would give them some oxygen, give them some morphine for pain, maybe some nitroglycerin, place them on a heart monitor, and we would wait. Oftentimes in the next hours, next day or two, they would extend their heart attack to the damage more. And in those days, nationwide, 10% of those folks died. It's just the way we treated heart attacks. And then in the mid-1980s, some, I think, Swiss or Austrian doctor figured you could do something called heart catheterization. You could even thread a little device called a stent into the area of the narrow coronary artery. So fairly quickly, the concept of time is muscle became an important concept. And so how do we get people to a heart cath lab quickly, particularly at a hospital like ours? Somewhere in the late 1990s, maybe about 1998, Dr. Wolf at the University of Wisconsin, cardiologist, he pulled together medical directors from the area. I was medical director at that time in our emergency room. And he said, we've got to find a way to get people more rapidly transferred to heart cath labs. So we did some analysis here at Columbus. And if we didn't admit the patient, we found our average time from the patient's arrival to the time they got onto an ambulance, or perhaps mid-flight, was about 5 to 6 hours. They spent 5 to 6 hours in our emergency room while we getting things arranged. In those days, let's give you a quick scenario if I can. So somebody came in with a myocardial infarction, the nurses had a protocol, they would do an EKG, but they might have been busy with another patient, and so maybe we'd get an EKG in the next half hour or an hour. Then finally the doctor would go and look at the EKG, oh, they're having a heart attack. And I think I ought to transfer that patient to one of the Madison hospitals, so I'd get on the phone and talk to somebody on the other end, the University of Wisconsin or St. Mary's or Meriter, usually University of Wisconsin, because that's where the MedFlight was located. And I talked to the cardiology fellow, perhaps at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he'd say, oh, that sounds like somebody we should see, I'll call my attending and we'll get back to you. Well, he'd get the attending out of bed, he'd talk to the attending, he'd say, yes, we'll accept your patient, how do you want to send them? I said, I think I'd like to send them by MedFlight if the weather permits. And so he said, okay, so I then called the MedFlight coordinator, and the MedFlight coordinator would say, where do you want to send the patient? And I'd have to say maybe which hospital, what kind of insurance do they have, and so on and so forth. Let me have you talk to our MedFlight doctor. So the MedFlight doctor would come on, the MedFlight doctor would say, I have to check with the pilot to see what the weather is doing, and we'll get back to you. So that all took 5 to 6 hours on average. So the challenge was, how do we make things happen? They figured out us poor peon doctors out in the countryside, we actually could read an electrocardiogram and tell when somebody was having an acute heart attack. So the way that goes now, and you probably said it goes even better now. So the ER doctor physician looks at that EKG, which is done within 5 minutes of the patient arriving in the emergency room. He's got what we call ST elevation changes on the electrocardiogram. This patient needs to go to a heart cath, go ahead and do the things by protocol we need to do, and I will get on the phone and get MedFlight. So nowadays you call MedFlight directly and say, I've got a STEMI in Columbus, send MedFlight. We don't talk about I didn't talk about where they were going, I didn't talk about the insurance. I said, we'll figure all that out by the time you get here. And so we have, over the years, I know even I stopped doing emergency medicine maybe about 5, 6, 7 years ago. We had times when we actually had sent patient to heart cath lab in Madison in less than 90 minutes. They call it door to balloon. From the time they arrived in our door to the time they're in a cath lab blowing up a balloon. And it goes through that in less than 90 minutes. Now that can be done regularly in the hospitals that have cath labs. But for those of us that are out here in Columbus and Beaver Dam and Portage and elsewhere, you know, we've got some work to do, and it's still possible, but everybody is a team. That I mentioned before, it's not just a team in our hospital, but we're a very integrated system these days with things like that. And now we're having the same kind of thing happen with strokes. You know, years ago somebody came with a stroke, we put them in the bed and we waited for the best. And now we just move very, very quickly, and same thing, you know, brain tissue time is brain tissue. So there's a lot of things that are being done for stroke patients that we didn't do before. So it's been great to see some of these changes. Could go on with other things I've seen with actually the practice of medicine and treatment of different kinds of disorders. The other big one I've seen so many changes is diabetes. It's just unbelievable the changes that we've seen there. So it's something we'll continue to be part of that, and I think because of what you heard tonight, our hospital is going to be on the forefront of that wherever we can be. We're going to believe that we can make those changes, and if they're affordable, we're going to continue to get better care as time goes on.
questions out there?
Okay, I'll give it back. One other thing, we got to wear colored tops. The changing of that was, and I don't remember the year that the state, Wisconsin State Hospital and Southern Colony went on strike. And that was the most devastating. And they had to transfer their children out from Southern Colony. In Columbus, they contacted us, and we got 13 patients. I happened to be working that night, and that's the most patients I've ever admitted on one day. But I was very grateful for, I think her name was Loretta Paulman. She worked the day shift up on surgical floor, and she said, I'll go home after work, and then I'll be back at 6 when they start arriving. So they were all placed in the private rooms in the old building, because after the new one was built, there were 2 patients to a room, every room. So anyway, during that period of time of carrying in, I don't remember how long it lasted, but it was several days or weeks. And so then I believe volunteers helped with coming in to help work with the children and feed, because some were really feisty and they knew just how to get into that refrigerator and different things, that you had to really monitor them quite closely. But so in order for us to care for them, they decided, the staff decided, or someone decided, that we could start wearing like these aprons that covered the whole top. You know, I forget what those copper aprons they were called or whatever. Well, we could wear those over instead of a white uniform. So that was the beginning of colored tops and pants at Columbus Community Hospital.
Any other questions? Joe?
Just a memory, back in the, well, first of all, my folks had a small orchard on the farm. And back in the 40s and 50s, the nuns used to come out in their angels' outfits and invade our orchard, picking up apples, and take them back to make applesauce. And that happened year after year. It was just a memory.
Beautiful.
Well, this was a lot of fun, and I just want to thank our panel again for being here tonight. I think we would like to come back and do another session, maybe about the volunteers, or just specifically nursing or physicians. I think that would be a lot of fun. So if you'd like to have us back, we sure would like to come back.
Thank you.
So, thank you, everyone. James Street.